You know, I went to an interesting Writers' Festival breakfast during the Sydney Writers' Festival recently, where George Friedman spoke. And I find some of George Friedman, who some of you may receive his Stratfor, his very interesting messages over the net. And George has a book that it seems to me that half of Sydney has read, to my surprise, The Next 100 Years, where George has, I think, some rather unusual suggestions, but nevertheless, that's his business, that the coming powers in the 21st century, along with the United States, will be Turkey, Mexico and Poland, which I've never quite been able to grasp the logic behind all of that. But I find some of his analyses about the dilemmas facing the president and indeed the community that is going to emerge, the international community in the 21st century, fascinating. And he was very interesting the other day. He said that Obama reminded him of other great presidents like Lincoln, Roosevelt, and Reagan, in that when they spoke, it seemed as if butter was falling out of their mouths. Butter wouldn't melt in their mouths, to get the analogy right, and yet they were utterly ruthless in the pursuit of very clever and determined political ends. So I thought the politics of what we are heading into with Obama, I think, are very interesting to wrestle with and perfect to consider in the question of sustainable globalisation. And I'm going to ask each of my guests today to characterise the politics that they think Obama represents, or what he finds he has to represent, because all commentators greet incoming presidents with a litany of tests that they think are unique to the time, and of course they're invariably not. But Barack Hussein Obama did seem to face an extraordinary array of challenges, both the financial crisis, incredible pent-up demand from his own side of politics, the progressive side of politics, who felt there'd been 3 decades of regression. So an incredible sense of wanting to move forward. The war on terror, or parts thereof, his foreign policy, in other words, how does he configure into the very volatile times into which he is, in which he's governing, and of course those protectionist impulses, understandable. Really, if we're honest, I think at a time such as we're in, particularly in the US, but will they have traction? So, I mean, that's just the broad outline, but I'm very happy to take my lead from you if you wish the discussion to go elsewhere, but that's the plan for this first session, and we'll have you out of here by 11 o'clock to have morning tea. So can I introduce you to Bruce McKern, who is Professor of International Business at the US Studies Centre and a graduate of the Stanford School of Business. Michael Fullilove is Director of Global Issues at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. He's a former Senior Fellow at the Brookings and a former Senior Advisor to Prime Minister Paul Keating. And Peter Gurevich is, as we just heard earlier, Professor of Political Science and founding Dean of the School of International Relations and Pacific Studies at the University of California, San Diego, and very much a specialist in international governance systems and the way in which countries do settle hostilities and move, despite all these signs, to new agreements. So, gentlemen, from what we know thus far, how would you characterise Obama's political agenda? Michael, how do you see it unfolding?
Well, I think you're right that that although butter wouldn't melt in Barack's mouth, he is a ruthless political operator. You don't get from the Illinois State Senate to the Oval Office in 4 years without an instinctive attraction to things that work and a ruthlessness in cutting off things that don't work. And I saw that last year at Brookings when he appointed Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. It was a brilliant strategic move. He brought a great rival into the tent. He he scored political points all over the horizon. And yet that appointment had enormous career-changing second-order effects for all the foreign policy wonks who had taken risks and signed on to Barack Obama's campaign, even though even against the express wishes of the Clinton team. So it's just one example of how, for Obama, he is everything is expendable except Obama and his agenda. Now, I don't say that as a criticism. I say I applaud that. I like to see that in a president. I like to see a president who is clear-eyed about what success requires. But people who see Obama as a Bambi and as weak, I think, are fooling themselves. That doesn't mean, I think, that pragmatism is the only theme in his politics. I think Obama is a genuine liberal. I think he unlike most Democrats, he didn't stew in the conservative soup of Washington for years and decades. He was the only Democrat, it seemed, the only mainstream Democrat who thought that he could win. He didn't have to look tougher than the Republicans in order to win the presidency. So he's a genuine liberal, I think, on the issues that Peter Garrett talked about on climate change. He's a true believer. He's called climate change one of the greatest moral challenges facing our generation. He is on the Middle East, on nuclear weapons, on many of these issues, he's a liberal. But he's also a supreme pragmatist. And I think, to me, this is the tension that will define Obama's presidency, and this is the really interesting dialogue to watch between the pragmatic and the liberal sides of Obama's character.
So you think he's a coalition builder, do you?
He's obviously a coalition builder. You've seen he's got an extraordinary capacity to bring Americans together. He's got an extraordinary capacity to bring the world together. The world favoured Obama's election over McCain by average margins of 4 or 5 to 1. And why is that? Part of that's because Obama is an African American, and people around the world, and especially on the margins of the world, are attracted by that narrative and of that historical circle being closed. The other element, I think, to it is that Obama is a child of globalisation. He's linked to the Middle East through his middle name. He's linked to Africa through his father. He's linked to Asia through his upbringing. One of the only areas he's not linked to is Australia. Maybe that's something we can come back to later. I don't think, but no. It's close and it's far. I mean, it's a completely different country, and I think his ties to Australia are much thinner than those of previous presidents. So while I think Obama's foreign policy is generally in sync with the Rudd government's and it's in sync with Australia's national interests, I think there are real challenges for us. But to your point, he's as a child of globalisation, it seems that all the different parts of the world can find a piece of Obama that they own in some sort of way. And that, I think, creates a real opportunity for America to exercise moral and political leadership on these very tangled, difficult questions like climate change.
Bruce, how would you characterise it?
Well, I'd agree with what Michael has said about the iron fist and the velvet glove. And I think this can be seen in domestic policy, particularly recently when we've seen what was once the largest automobile company in the world, with 50% of the American market, go into bankruptcy. And this has been very much pushed by Obama. And, of course, he's been very conscious of the need to preserve jobs. But he hasn't allowed it to be done in a way that would actually wreck the possibility of saving those jobs. And so we've seen that managed bankruptcy of General Motors take place. I think, again, he's pragmatic about that. He sees the need for change because of the legacy of mistakes that have been made by General Motors over the years, along with its sweetheart deals with the unions, and he's allowed that to happen. I think on another area he's showing strength as well, and that is his recent concern about changing the tax code, which presently allows U.S. companies which accumulate profits offshore not to be taxed on those profits until they're repatriated to the U.S. Now, this has created an enormous outrage and concern amongst the multinational enterprises, and it's not at all clear whether he will succeed in getting this through. But my point is that he is pushing very hard and willing to risk disfavour with business in order to get that kind of action taken.
What do you think he does think of business?
I think it's hard to say. I think Obama respects the need for business. I don't think he's going to socialize the American economy, although there are some elements of that in the policies we've seen, of course. I think he understands that the American people respect business and need it, and he understands that the economy is not going to grow unless business has a degree of freedom. The area that concerns me most is the banking sector, because I believe there will be attempts, both in the Congress and also on the side of Obama, to push for tougher regulation. Now, some of that's going to be needed, and certain parts of the banking sector or the non-banking sector are going to have to be brought in to the regulatory environment. But the danger is that it goes too far.
There's some due next week, some new regulations I just heard this morning.
I'm not sure what those are, but there are regulations now on what can be paid to bank executives, although Obama himself has stepped back from enforcing a blanket requirement. But I believe that the financial sector, although it has, of course, suffered from excesses, needs to have flexibility, needs to have the ability to innovate. And getting that balance right is going to be a challenge for him.
One of our former Prime Ministers, you know, Robert Menzies, I asked that question about what he thought of business with very definite care, because Menzies had a very remote view of business, and he was known to have said to one of his chiefs, "The ability to make money, dear boy, is a very low-grade skill." And I just wondered whether deep down it's possible that Obama had that view.
I don't think the American population shares Robert Menzies' view. If they were aware of it.
Quite so. Peter, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with my colleagues on the pragmatism of Obama. I think this is a very pragmatic guy. One of the fascinating dinner conversation questions of about a year and a half ago during the primary season was, it was fun to ask at dinner, do you think who is more to the left, Hillary or Obama? And it was very interesting how much people disagreed on that. I was of the school that thought that Obama was somewhat more conservative than Hillary. And it was interesting because many people were for Obama who thought he was more liberal. I think he's deep, pragmatic, centrist kind of guy, and he is very careful to look at. He does not think he can go faster than what the public can support and what he can mobilize support for. So he's pragmatic in doing that. In his inaugural speech, he had a sentence which has fascinated me. It's my new dinner party conversation question. He said, "It's time to put away childish things," a biblical quote. Now, the question I ask people, what's the childish things that Obama is asking us to put away, because he never did explain what that was? And my answer to that is he wants the liberals to put away the idea that the government can solve all problems, and he wants the conservatives to abandon the idea that the government is useless. And I think that our problem talking about Obama and his people is, in a way, thinking about older categories and trying to impose them on him. What does he think of business? I don't think he has the older left generation's hostility towards business. That's not part of the culture that he grew up in. Does he want big government is one of the questions. I think that's kind of not the right way to think about it. They want government is useful for some things, not for other things. And he wants government to be smart, and he wants government to be effective. And so the constant question is where to pull government back and where to let it go forward. I think it's ideological in a way to say that the Democrats are big government and the Republicans are not, because government grew under Reagan and it grew under Bush. It hasn't gotten any smaller. The libertarians are furious at Bush for that very reason, as they were about Reagan. So the debate is over where can you use government, where can you not use government, in what ways. I think they think a lot about ideas about making it smarter. If we have time later, we could talk about nudge, and Cass Sunstein and that set of ideas are very interesting. I think they're revelatory of the way that they think about government. So I think he's been quite remarkable so far. He was facing several crises all at the same time. This financial crisis, suddenly banks, credit markets, everything was seizing up. Key thing was to get all that going again. Well, it seems to be going. The stock market in the U.S. was Dow Jones was 14,000 a year and a half ago. In February, it was down to 6,500. Now it's back up to 8,700. That seems stable. But what is it? So that part seems to be happening. But then there's this tremendous economic contraction that you have, and now you've got to get the economy going. So that's the demand stimulus part, worry about that. Of course, now everybody's worried about so much money is being spent on that, we're going to have deficits. But, you know, for the time being, the problem is to get the economy functioning again. And then the third element is what are the long-run structural changes that have to happen in all these areas that you've mentioned, the banking system, healthcare system. I think healthcare, is part. Healthcare, corporate governance, financial regulation, all those are part of the long-run issues that have to be dealt with as well as globalization. How do we rethink the relationship of the different pieces of the economy to each other? And globally, that's the long-run challenges that he has to deal with. But given the overwhelming number of things that he's had to deal with, I think so far they've been pragmatic and sensible. He's been mobilizing political support. Each of these things he got through the Congress, which is no mean feat.
I mean, the childish things is a very interesting challenge for us to think about, and I wonder whether no health care is one of the childish things. Our guest, who couldn't be here with us today, Gina Desprez, she believes that if he doesn't get health care through soon, he will have wasted a crisis. You know, the great Rahm Emanuel quote, never waste a good crisis. I mean, are you of that view?
No, I'm not of the view that it has to happen right away. He's gone. It's kind of a quantity theory of power. If you don't use it, you lose it. I don't think it's quite like that. I think that the importance of healthcare to me is that it's part of the structural changes. And one of the questions we're worried about is protectionism. Why are we worried about protectionism? Because when you have competition, some people hurt more than others. And one of the ways in which Americans hurt from competition, if they lose their job, they often lose their health care. So that, to me, an important reason to get health care through is to make a kind of a renewed contract with people in the country. We're going to push for free trade because it's a good thing for the world, but we're going to soften the blow to you. You're not going to be the individuals who have to pay all the adjustment costs. And that's what the countries that have healthcare systems kind of have spread the adjustment costs around. So I think, to me, that's the importance of healthcare, aside from the virtue that people should be healthy. I'm all for that. But it also is to be part and parcel of making an economy capable
It's a grand compact, really.
It's a grand compact, and I think other countries have done a better job than the United States in creating that grand compact. So I think of it in those terms. Now, what the timing of it is, I'm not sure I would agree with her that, you know, unless we see it by December, the game is over. I don't think so.
So the notion that there is this extraordinary pent-up demand within the Democrats that could overtake him, you clearly don't see that. You think he can manage his own constituency?
Oh, no, I think that's real. I think that is putting a finger on something real. He has, you know, the idea that Democrats have a filibuster-proof majority is just a technicality. They're such a heterogeneous. The way that the Democrats have regained Senate majority is that Rahm Emanuel and Schumer in New York senator were very carefully for the past 6 years, went out and picked candidates all across the country that had a good chance of winning in their states by being moderates. So the number of the Democrats that got them from the 47, 48 to 59, a lot of them are very moderate people who are going to be very cautious about just doing any old thing. So yes, indeed, he has to bargain, he has to maneuver, he has to make deals. So, I mean, like Michael, I like that about him. Every time I read a story about him, he fascinates me. You know, there's this grand rhetoric, these tremendous things. So, well, is that what he is? Well, he is that. And that is a form of power. It's a very fascinating form of power. The speeches he gives, I remember when he gave the speech on race in Philadelphia when he's having trouble with his minister, it was mesmerizing. The number of people I know moderate voters who would never have voted for a Democrat, who they were so touched by that speech they were going to vote for him. That's an extraordinary form of power. That's an extraordinary form of influence. It's very unclear what it translates into. We don't really know concretely how that translates into. I'm sort of a policy wonk, so I think, how many votes is that speech going to bring him when the health care bill comes up in the Senate? I don't know the answer to that. But I am convinced that they understand that game and that is what he is. He talks about changing the conversation. And I think he means that globally. I think the speech in Cairo was changing the conversation in the Middle East. Speeches he gives in the U.S. are changing the conversation. That's very fascinating. It has a rhetorical effect. But what we now have to watch is see how does it actually translate into specific actions. I think he's going to have his hands full with the Democrats in Congress, for sure.
Yes. Well, Michael will know that I met him down the street, and Michael was rather excited by the prospect of Obama's presidency, and I was perversely resisting, and I have perversely resisted being seduced. But I have to say that the Obama speech in Cairo, which I watched, I thought was a masterful case of attempting something that I thought, he pulled off to a considerable extent. And I had Paul Wolfowitz on my program on Saturday morning, and I could tell that despite himself, he was massively proud to have been an American listening to that, and very, very impressed with the scale of what was being undertaken. But Michael, this question, what do you think is a classic mistake or a misreading of Obama that, say, a place like Australia could make? Or of how he, given what you've studied him in detail, and you were appalled at my attitudes, actually, as I recall, on the day that I tackled you. What do you think where are misreadings? Even though I think Peter's right, it's hard to say where all this is heading.
Well, first of all, I mean, I remember the exchange we had in the street, and it was a little unfair because I had recently come back from Boston, where I'd seen him give his breakthrough speech to the Democratic National Convention, and it blew me away. I mean, someone who could give a speech that resonated with these sorts of themes, who could come from nowhere, who was a state senator from Illinois, and who could construct in simple but elegant language this kind of argument. I thought, what sort of power does this give a political candidate? And the next day, I saw him give a different kind of speech, which actually goes to your earlier question about what he thinks about business. And it showed the different side of Obama, because he addressed a group that was smaller than this, only about 50 or 100 people. And Hillary Clinton and John Edwards and a whole bunch of people addressed this audience, which was made up of very wealthy, high-rolling donors to the Democratic Party. And all of them gave very white-bread speeches, very pro-business speeches about this and that. And Obama got up and gave a completely different speech. And he said, I look out in this crowd, I see a lot of rich folk. And people in Chicago often ask me, Barack, why do you hang out with these rich folk? And I could feel everyone around me saying, oh my God, where's he going with this? And Obama goes, I'll tell you, when anyone asks me that, I just remind them what my pastor in Chicago, Illinois, we didn't know how controversial his pastor would be. I remind them what my pastor in Chicago, Illinois says every Sunday: God loves a cheerful giver. And of course the audience loved it, because Americans don't regard it as an insult to be told that they're wealthy, quite the reverse. But I saw in that a couple of things. I saw an ability to pivot, to one night give a grand speech about the American story, and the next day to give a very funny off-the-cuff speech. Secondly, I actually detected a certain pragmatism about how you deal with wealth and with business people. I actually think that if you look at the different elements of his career, he's consistently turned away from opportunities to work in business, to work on Wall Street, to work in law firms. So I do detect an ambivalence. But thirdly, this ultimate pragmatism that he knew if he won these people over, that it was good for his political career. To your question about the misreadings, I think it's interesting that I think Obama's critics have been so wrong-footed by his success and by his approach. And often you can tell how effective a leader is by how angry and divided and confused his enemies are. And I see, certainly on the foreign policy side, I see critics misreading him in two entirely opposite ways. On the one hand, half the critics of Obama's foreign policy criticise him for being weak and supine and bloodless and un-American. So Charles Krauthammer said after his Cairo speech the other day that he had done more in 3 minutes to delegitimise Israel than any other president in American history. Krauthammer has said that Obama goes abroad and apologises for the country and is doing a lot to undermine American power. And then on the other side, you have conservative critics who say the exact opposite. You have Greg Sheridan in this country, you have the Wall Street Journal editorial opinion page in the United States that say, in fact, Obama is exactly the same as Bush, that his policies are indistinguishable. And I think when you have critics disagreeing so fundamentally on what Obama stands for, it shows the enormous success he has, the ability he has to come right down the centre. And I think that's where his foreign policy is. It's different from Bush's in many different ways, and his domestic policy as well. It's noticeably different, and yet it's not what they regard. It's certainly not this kind of red-blooded leftism. So I think it's a very good position on the spectrum for him to be.
I don't want to completely, because I want to come to Bruce in a moment, but I don't want to get onto this. But what did you think of his attitude to Israel? Because there's been some very interesting writing about how, in some ways, he is wedging Israel, which may play into Netanyahu's chances or not. I mean, again, there's been extraordinarily divided opinion. But to focus on the settlements, where there isn't a great deal of, for which there isn't a great deal of approval in the US and the US Jewish community, is very clever, isn't it?
Well, it's clever. I mean, it's necessary because one of the obstacles to getting a peace deal, I don't think he's wedging Israel. I think he's applying leverage and pressure to the Israeli government. He's putting Netanyahu in a difficult position because, on the one hand, many of his government have very close connections to the settlement movement. On the other hand, the Israeli public know the huge advantage of a strong strategic relationship with the United States. But then here you see the Obama balance as well, because there was so much in that speech that was great for Israel and great for Israelis. He talked about the unbreakable bond between the United States and Israel. He talked about vile anti-Semitism. He addressed head-on the kind of myths and awful, ugly Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism that you get throughout the Middle East. So I thought it was a very finely calibrated speech and a very balanced speech, and that's exactly the platform that he needs if he's going to make progress on the Arab-Israeli situation.
Bruce, do you want to comment on that, or I'll move on?
I just wanted to comment on Michael's point about the ability of Obama to speak to both sides of the political spectrum. There was a comment made by one of his colleagues about a speech he made when I think he was standing for a position on the Harvard Law Review. And this colleague said that in the speech there were people who were opposed to his point of view and those who were in favour of his point of view, and both sides were nodding in approval. That's an extraordinary skill. So.
That is, indeed. I wonder how much you think he has the capacity to enable the USA to retain its leadership role economically and financially. And how much does he even think of it like that, I wonder?
I'm sure that he's concerned about US economic power, because military power flows from economic power. But there's not very much a president can do in that respect, apart from restoring the health of the economy. And that's, of course, not entirely in his hands. It's in the hands of the Federal Reserve and all of the other agencies. But to the extent that he has some role to play, he will be very concerned at the future strength of the US economy. And I think it's worth making the point here that the US is not going to disappear from what we often think about as economic globalization. Globalization has many different meanings to different people, but in terms of economic aspects, I see it very much in terms of international trade and international foreign direct investment, the moving of capital between countries and the establishment of enterprises there. And Obama will support that, despite what I said earlier about his attempt to claw back tax from offshore subsidiaries. The US is still by far the leader in the world in terms of its implantation of foreign investment around the world. It's by far the leader in terms of its technological strength. There are many, many indicators we could look at. And although China, of course, is rising very fast, and although China actually is now ahead of the United States in terms of its share of world exports, and although it's also ahead of the United States in its share of technologically intensive exports, I think those are indicators which show that the balance of power is shifting. But in terms of what we see as the presence of the United States around the world in an economic sense, in a business sense, Obama is not going to want to change that, and he's going to be supportive of it. What he may be doing, I think, is encouraging those changes that we see happening in the management of enterprises, the concern now for much better understanding of the implications of the global value chain, of tracing the global value chain right down to the source of the inputs, which may or may not be subject to poor working conditions, as Rick will talk about to us later on, or may not be subject to slavery, as in the case of some iron ore products coming out of Brazil. So there's, I think, that tendency happening throughout American multinationals, and that's a tendency that I think he would certainly support.
So that's almost a classic liberal tendency then, you're saying, is starting.
It's quite interesting that just last week, I think it was, Harvard Business School had its graduation of MBA students. And out of some 800 who were graduating, approximately 400 signed up to a manifesto that they would seek to behave in their business dealings in an ethical and responsible and appropriate manner. Now, when they're hit with the hard reality of day-to-day business dealings, some of that may be lost, but I think it's a very interesting change, and it's a change we see in business schools throughout the world.